Hello, everyone. Welcome to the October edition of the All Bugs Good and Bad webinar series. Today we have Dr. Jeremy Pickens, Alabama Extension Specialist, to talk to us about scale insects on ornamental plants.
Hey, thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm going to talk about scale insects on ornamental crops, since that's the crops I mainly deal with as ornamental nursery and greenhouse crops. And I am not an entomologist, I'm a horticulturist, but we all have to battle the same bugs. I'll do my best to go over this material with you today. So scale insects, they're easily distinguished from other insects because they have a waxy protective coating over their bodies. This provides protection from predators. They're called scales because they kind of look like barnacles growing on the sides of these insects, and they lay their eggs under these. And so it makes it a little challenge to treat scales with insecticides, or it makes it a challenge for predators to get to them because they kind of have this armor over them, protecting them or their eggs. So the order of Hemiptera, and that in a suborder that also they share with aphids, mealybugs, whiteflies, and several other piercing, sucking insects. And so they have similar mouth parts to aphids and whiteflies. They have a stylet that's kind of like a straw, and they use that to pierce plant tissue or vascular tissue or cells, where they can suck all the nutrients or plant sap from that tissue or cell. So that sap that they're pulling out is full of sugars, and they can't process all that. Now scales, they're going to pierce and aim for that phloem vascular tissue. They're phloem feeders. And if you think about phloem, if you remember for anything from biology, phloem tissue, it flows down to the roots. So we have our leaves that make all these sugars, and the phloem transports those sugars to the roots, and that's what these scales are feeding on. And when they do, they can't process all that sugar, so they excrete a lot of it in the form of excrement. You may be familiar with aphids. They do that through their tailpipes. And so this sugary substance accumulates on leaves or anything that it falls on, and you'll get this mold or fungus called sooty mold that'll grow on it, and it can turn the leaves or stems or whatever it lands on, cars, black. You can even rub it off with your fingers. So here's a picture of some sooty mold here and some scales on it. So with life stages, the females, they can be parthenogenic. They don't necessarily need a male to reproduce. And so they can lay their eggs under the scale's protective covering, and often that's where they're going to hatch. They may stay under that protective covering for a short period of time and brood. And so after they hatch, you have your first instar or nip, and this is commonly referred to as a crawler. And for most scales, that's going to be the only mobile stage of the scales. The adults are pretty much sedentary and don't move around. In fact, most of the adults lose their legs in maturity, and so they just stay put once they settle in and start feeding. They don't have a need for any legs. Now, most scales have a synchronized crawler stage. That means that all of them are going to hatch about the same time. And that's important to know because that stage is the easiest to control scales. If you knock out all those little babies, you can prevent that next generation from coming into play. And so that's when they're most susceptible. They're getting out. They don't have that waxy scale armor yet, and they're able to. They're more susceptible to predators, natural enemies, and sprays. But they hatch all at the same time. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. You can easily control them with horticultural oils or soaps. Now, it's a little difficult sometimes to keep an eye on these crawlers. These crawlers are really small, and some folks will take double-sided sticky tape, like you'd use in arts and crafts or to hang up posters, and they'll wrap it around small twigs or put it on leaves anywhere near a scale, adult female scale, where crawlers may be crawling. And so the crawler will crawl on that tape, and then they will get stuck to it. That's an easy way to monitor for those crawlers Now there's some time you can kind of know when they're going to be crawling based on phenology or when a plant's blooming. That's kind of specific to which species you're talking about. And often, a lot of times, the scales you see, most of them are dead. They just stick around after they die. And so one way to tell if they're still alive is you can squish them with your fingers and look for juice, or poke them with a needle and see if any juice comes out of them. And that's one way to tell if they're alive. So there's a couple different types of scales that kind of fall into a couple different groups. One of those groups is soft scales. So they have a soft waxy covering. Now you can't remove this covering from the insect. It's all one and the same. They don't detach. They're larger than most of your armor scales, these soft scales. They can be probably the most difficult scale to control. There's also armored scales, and so they have a real hard, armored coating over them. Now you can remove that coating, and it will detach most often from that adult female or male. So there's a couple different shapes. They have rounded. They have these pupillar. I can't pronounce that, but it's kind of an oblong shape, and then they have an oyster shell type shape. And most of the armored scales, once they start feeding, most of their instars are going to start growing that waxy covering on. You can actually tell the age of the scale based on the size of that armor coating, as you see in this picture here. So armor scales, they do typically reproduce sexually. You know, most of the soft scales, they can do it asexually. And they're going to feed on the xylem. So they're not the phloem. So there's not really any sugar going up through the plant to the leaves, where that's the direction the xylem takes plant. So you're not going to see a lot of honeydew or sooty mold when it comes to these armored scales. They're also going to you'll see a slow decline in the host. You might see them kind of the canopy kind of open up on them as they're under a little bit of stress, but it's a very slow general decline of the host. There's also some felt or bark scales, and this is one we really haven't had to deal with a lot, other than some azalea bark scale. But now we have crepe myrtle bark scale. They are phloem feeders, and they produce a considerable amount of sooty mold, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So control methods for scales, they actually have a lot of natural enemies, so a lot of good bugs that feed on these, and they can keep, for the most part, a lot of them under control and at bay, where it's really not worth treating, depending on the species. Oftentimes, when folks are trying to control these scales, they're spraying a lot of pyrethroids, just real broad spectrum insecticides, and when they do that, they kill a lot of these natural enemies. You might see these scale population kind of flare up or increase pressure on you. You know, oftentimes, like I said earlier, those exoskeletons and the hard coverings hanging around after they die. In fact, probably about 75% of the scales you see on a plant are dead. So again, how to determine if they're alive or dead, you can squish them or poke them with a needle and look for any of that juice or body fluid to come out of them. So some of those natural enemies, the parasitoid wasp emerging from inside a scale insect. Here's a picture of it here. There's also some flies that will do some similar type action where they'll deposit an egg inside the scale, and it'll develop in there, basically eating the scale from the inside out, kind of like that movie Aliens. It's pretty creepy, but it is incredibly efficient at controlling scale populations. You can see when this happens, when parasites emerge, you can see a little hole in the outer covering of a scale. That doesn't mean that's where the crawlers came from. The crawlers actually crawl underneath the scale itself. If you see a hole in it, that's from a parasite. There's also a lot of predators. Lady beetles, ladybugs do a great job of keeping scales under control, especially some of the juvenile ladybugs. They're very, very aggressive, and they can do a great job keeping that population under control, and almost, in some cases, even some curative type type control methods you see with lady beetles. Now, chemical controls, you know, a lot of times, like I was telling you earlier, if you can hit them when the crawling stage, if it is a synchronized species, you can really set them back with oils and soaps, a lot of the soft chemistry type materials, where and then sometimes some species, those oils can kill the adults, but you got to have really good coverage. Even if you do kill the adults, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to kill the eggs under that scale. So oftentimes, for example, a false oleander scale, you know, a mineral oil, horticultural oil can really do a great job. You know, 90% control on most of the adults, but it never kills any of the eggs, and so it makes treating a little difficult. But again, good coverage is essential, and it can be a tough situation, especially with some of these species. They happen to be on the underside of the leaves. It can be really difficult to get good coverage with some of these softer chemistry type insecticides. You know, general contact insecticides, you know, you can really wipe out the crawlers with them, but again, you're probably going to be reducing your natural enemy population if you use those. So systemics, it's a great set of chemistries, but you got to be really careful how you use these. So a systemic insecticide is an insecticide that you can apply to the plant, and it moves throughout the whole plant. One of the most popular or most widely used would be the neonicotinoid class of insecticides, such as imidacloprid or dinetetfuran. And so that moves to the whole plant. The scale will feed on the plant tissue, and that insecticide's inside that plant, and it can control the scales that way. Now, again, it will not kill the eggs. There's also translaminar products or chemistries where it moves primarily just through the leaves. You know, so if you were to spray on the top side of a leaf, it can move through to the bottom side of the leaf, and that can be helpful for certain pests that hang out on the bottom side of the leaves. Now, you got to be careful with these because these also, especially for foliar applications, can wipe out your natural enemies also. There's also issues associated with pollinators. You're probably aware with a lot of the coverage that neonics have gotten as far in terms of pollinator struggles. You know, so, and that's primarily through misapplication. You know, you should never apply a neonicotinoid to a plant that's in bloom, especially if it's one that is going to attract pollinators. So that's something you really got to be careful with, but they are highly effective in controlling most scale species. So we have a great publication. If you go to aces.edu, David Hale put this out about 2 years ago on controlling scale insects and mealybugs, because you kind of can treat them about the same. It's got some great recommendations in there for management. You see here we've got the crawler hatch time for common scales kind of summarized, and then based on the stage of the scale, what you might use for management tool, whether it's an oil or systemic insecticide. Some great resources in that publication. I'll throw it up here one more time in case you need to write the title down. So we'll just kind of go through some of the scales. So one of the soft scales is the Florida wax scale. It's a pretty large scale. It's about a 1/4 inch long. You can normally see it if you're standing, you know, 10 or 15 feet away from at least the mature adults. Normally this scale will align itself on the mid vein and the ribs, the vascular tissue of the leaf. That's where you most often will see them if they can get direct access to that phloem. And they do produce a significant amount of sooty mold, these Florida wax scales. So here in Mobile, we're on the Gulf Coast, and you get about 2 to 3 generations of Florida wax scale, depending on what latitude you're at. So in Florida, they're looking at about 3 generations a year. For most of us, we're probably looking at 2 generations. Now, our first generation makes its cameo around May 18th. Here in Mobile, our agriculture inspector has got a great calendar, and he lets us know when he starts seeing those crawlers. But April, May, June, July to August is typically when you'll see your second generation, and your third generation normally occurs in the late fall, October, November, and that's typically in Florida. Now, something kind of neat that they've really never observed any male scales of this Florida wax scale. Any male have never really been observed as of now. So that's pretty neat. The first instar, they hatch after 2 to 3 weeks of egg development. So these older nymph stages, they may move around a little bit. So you may start growing some of that wax on them, but as the plant puts out new flush, they're going to move to that more succulent growth. And so as they start developing this wax around them, they do it in these little tufts, and it kind of gives them a star-like appearance, especially the small ones. And I'll go back to that picture to show you. You can see the small ones in here. They kind of have those little tufts protruding through them, so it kind of looks like little stars for the those juvenile Florida wax scales nymphs. And so some of the hosts, probably the most common host that I see this on is Burford holly or dwarf Burford hollies. They get on a lot of the Chinese hollies, Ilex cornuta. They hit up Indian hawthorn pretty good. They are a pest of citrus. They have been found on crepe myrtle, deodar cedar, elms, loblolly pines, oaks, several other species, but primarily you'll see these on Indian hawthorn and Burford Chinese hollies. I even saw some on some boxwoods just the other day, but it wasn't a major issue. Again, you'll see a lot of sooty mold associated with these. And I normally see them on the lower branches first, and then they kind of work their way up into the canopy. There are several parasitoids that attack these pests. Now, if you see a few on your plant, this goes without saying for all these scale insects. It's almost better just go in there and smash them or wipe them off, or remove that leaf if you can, rather than doing a chemical treatment. Because again, you can really, these natural enemies can really keep them at bay. But once you start spraying, you're kind of taking them out of the equation. So if you have the opportunity to, you see a couple of these guys, just go ahead and pick those leaves off and smash it. Now, you know, if you want to start looking for them, around April, you can start flipping up some of these scales. You know, on the underside, you're going to see some of the eggs fall out. You'll see several hundred eggs come out of these scales, and they are a synchronized crawler stage. So you can hit them with some foliar applications of oils or soaps, or a pyrethroid that's not going to have a long residual. Normally, you're going to need to do this every 7 to 10 days apart. Again, you can monitor by using the double-sided sticky tape, or flipping them up and looking around for those crawlers. So if you're going to use a systemic, again, these work great. These neonicotinoids work great on controlling these, but you really got to be careful, because hollies are a big pollinator crop or plant, especially for honeybees. I see a lot of honeybees on Ilex cornuta. Those and Indian hawthorns for us are blooming around May when I see that first generation start crawling. So you got to really think hard about using a systemic, depending on what stage that plant is blooming or not. So brown soft scales, these are really difficult to control. And for most of us, we're going to see these on house plants. They get on orchids and ferns. You'll see them on citrus. I see them a little bit more in real shady areas where the humidity's high, but that may just be my observations. They're oval shaped. Most of the time you'll see them kind of flat and maybe slightly convex. The females are usually a 1/4 inch. They lay a lot of eggs over their lifetime, about 250, but they're putting those out slowly over time, maybe a few every couple of days. They're putting them out. You might get 6 to 7 generations a year inside a greenhouse or inside your house on your house plant, maybe on a weeping fig or something like that. They do target stems and leaves. If you see them on leaves, are often in the midribs, kind of like the Florida wax scale. The females do molt twice before reaching maturity. You can get a generation, if the temperature's right, every 60 days or so. You can see some ants here tending these soft brown scales. And what these ants are doing, they're feeding on that honeydew. And in doing that, it keeps those ants around and kind of wards off any of those natural enemies. So one way to control this scale is to get rid of the ants. So then you can allow some of those natural enemies to come in and do their job, taking out that scale insect. So these are kind of mama's boys, although most of them are probably girls. So they hatch, and they're going to stick around mom for a while. So they brood in there for a few days under mom's protective coating before they're ready to leave. And when they do leave, they don't go all that far. That's why you often will see them kind of stacked on top of each other, because they don't go all that far from their the parent scale. So you normally see them in clusters up and down the leaves, and sometimes you may even see them kind of overlapping where they're kind of grown in to each other. So again, there's several parasites out there. They're just in the environment that take them out. But guess what? You probably don't have these in your home. So you can just kind of physically remove them. You can use a horticultural oil, but if you're going to use an oil, you need to be really careful about applying that during certain times of the day. If it's really hot outside, you can get some burning on your plants. If you're indoor plant and you want to use a systemic, you can find one that's labeled. That's probably just fine. There's not going to be many pollinators flying around inside of your home on these on your house plants. Again, ferns, they really like ferns, citrus, weeping figs, orchids. They have a pretty wide host range, and just so happens many of those are house plants. This is kind of a neat one that a lot of people don't know about. It's called Mascale's scale, and it's an armored scale. And it primarily, well, not primarily, specifically targets conifer species. So it does several generations per year. We don't know a lot about this scale. It's really hard to find and see, and so there's its life cycle is largely unknown. You can kind of look for yellow or browning on the foliage or the needles of some of the susceptible species. Again, they're very small. This is under a microscope. They're really hard to see. This is a oyster type shell or scale. We were talking about the shapes earlier. They're not heavy egg producers. You can just barely see some of these eggs under the scales coating after we flipped it up. There's a lot of eggs considering the size of the female. So up in Maryland, they've done probably where the most of this work's taking place. They've done about where they've had 2 generations per year. And outside, they start seeing their first generation about 350 degree days. And that kind of varies on where you are, but pretty early in the year. It doesn't take a lot of warm temperatures to get your first generation of this scale. So it's got a fairly wide array of host ornamental crops such as arborvitae, junipers, leyland cypress, some of your cryptomerias, cameocypress. You'll normally see them in the leaf axis here. You can see here on this arborvitae where they're kind of hanging out between those needles. So most systemics will work just fine on these. In fact, because the crawlers are so tiny, it's really hard to see when they're in the crawling stage. So this may be a good candidate for systemics, and we don't often have a lot of pollinators on conifers anyway. Now here in Mobile, our agriculture agent inspector has observed a parasitic fungus that's been attacking these scales. In fact, he looks for the fungus first, and then he can find the scales. It's a pink fungus. I apologize for not having a picture of it, but that seems to be keeping them pretty well under control here in the on the Gulf Coast area. T-scale, this is one you'll see on camellias, and this is one of the scales that you'll see on the underside of the leaf. And it gets pretty nasty pretty quick. I normally see it on camellias that aren't well tended in real shady areas where it's real high humidity. So just really kind of opening up that plant and maybe pruning off some of those lower limbs and pulling out some of those leaves can kind of prevent this scale from becoming a big problem. They're very small scale, about 1.5 millimeters. They call them T scales because they get on tea plants, which is a camellia species. And so they also attack our ornamental Sanqua and japonica camellias. They've been around the U.S. At least since 1908, and it's primarily in the southern states and some of the other states like Texas and California. But camellia, and you'll also see them on some hollies. Find these you really need to flip over the plant leaves, to look for that form on the underside of the leaves. And that makes treatment a challenge, especially with a camellia and a holly, because it's got a very waxy surface to it. And sometimes some of those translaminar products can't get through that real thick waxy coating on those leaves. So it may take a high pressure sprayer to get under those plants to get good coverage, maybe even an air blast sprayer, or sometimes you can take your nozzle on the wand of your sprayer and kind of bend it upright and really pump that spray up to get high pressure and get kind of a fine mist under those leaves. The scales, they appear on the bottom of the leaves as a white fuzzy mass. You flip that leaf over, sometimes you'll see some chlorotic damage. It almost looks like a virus on the top of the leaf, and you'll flip it over and you'll see a bunch of those scales. Again, I see it a lot in real shady, high humidity, and plants that are just kind of generally under stress. Maybe they haven't been taken care of all that well. So if you see some of these, you can pull them off. That'd be the best thing to do first. 2 to 3 applications of an oil or soap, normally 10 days apart in the spring. Again, a lot of the parasitoids attack these, so just kind of, if you can, stay away from anything that might harm those. If you are going to use chemical application, a spreader sticker really helps out, especially because of that waxy coating on those leaves, and try to get them on the other side of the leaf if you can. So cotton cushiony scale, this is a pretty neat scale, and here's a picture of some Vidalia bugs eating on one of those. They have a pretty wide host range: citrus, nandina, pittosporum, rose, mimosa. They get on a pretty good bit of ornamental plant species. They're really easy to recognize because they have these fluted egg sacs, so you can see the front of the scale, kind of where the legs are. That's where the body of the scale is, and behind it, they have where they rear their eggs under their protective coating. It kind of reminds me of a whale, the throat of a whale. In that flute, they probably have 600 to 800 eggs. They can be about a ½ inch long, so they're pretty big. And you can see one on the rose plant, and if you'll notice, it still has its legs, which is kind of unique with this scale because it will still move around on the plant, unlike most of the other scales. It is not completely sedentary. It moves very slowly, but it will move around the plant, which is pretty unique to it. Most often you'll see the adult females on branches and trunks, not typically a foliage feeder. The crawlers are red with black legs. You can see a picture of them here. And they have about 2 to 3 generations a year, and they can be a pretty aggressive scale, especially in the greenhouse. So the nymphs will leave behind a lot of moltings in their early scale development stages as they molt, kind of contributing to the branches kind of looking like it's got a bunch of this cotton or cushiony type material on it. And so those can be managed pretty well with natural enemies. This Vidalia beetle just tears them up. They have several parasitic flies. These are ants really like this species also because of the sooty mold. So if you can control those ants, you can kind of allow those natural predators to do their jobs. You can buy some of these predators in if you have a greenhouse. Some people are even putting a sticky material around the base of plants. And so a lot of those crawlers get stuck on it, so it's kind of a physical barrier, preventing them from crawling up to higher stems. So insecticides don't control the adults all that great. Again, you can monitor with the double-sided sticky tape. You can really hammer those crawlers with the soils and oaks when they are crawling. But it's been noted that imidacloprid, that neonic, which works pretty well on most scale insect, does not do that great of a job on this species. And it's really toxic to this Vidalia beetle, which is a great natural enemy to this pest. So probably what's getting the most attention right now as far as scales is the crepe myrtle bark scale. We all love our crepe myrtles, and now which is crepe myrtles for the most part, other than a little bit of aphid damage, flea beetle damage, primarily are insect pests free. You know, they don't have a lot of problems with insect pests, but this scale can really wreak havoc on crepe myrtle populations. You can see they do produce a fair amount of sooty mold. Here is a photo taken in Texas when they were dormant. You can see how those branches and trunks are all black from that sooty mold growing on it. So like we said earlier, it is a felt scale. It's native to Asia. It's the same genus as the azalea bark scale, but it's a different species. And they do about 2 to 4 generations per year. And these are primarily going to be on stems, even really small twigs, stems and trunks of the trees. They may see a few on the foliage, but these primarily are going to be on their bark feeders. So here's the distribution of it right now. You know, you see these maps, these distribution maps, and you see these counties lit up, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're all over that county. For example, my home county down in the coastal Alabama, Baldwin County, it's only isolated in a few areas, but it is spreading. It was first found in Dallas, Texas in 2004, so it has spread a pretty good bit, and that could be through nursery stock. It's likely that's how it's being spread. So if you're a nursery grower or a landscaper, it's really good to inspect your liners when they come in, or your stock plants for this if you're coming from an area that's known to have crepe myrtle bark scale. So the damage, it really just makes these trees ugly. You get really poor growth. You'll see just a general decline in the plant. Obviously, the foliage, the stems, the trunk, everything turns black. And you see a lot of this white, looks like barnacles growing on the sides of the trees, and that's the actual scales. It can really reduce the bloom number and just makes a big mess if you park your car under one of these trees or have a picnic table under it. There's going to be sooty mold all over it. It's a very messy pest. The crawlers are very, very small. They're highly likely spread by wind, maybe humans, landscapers potentially, equipment. They even think that birds landing on trees may provide an opportunity for these scales to move from tree to tree. And again, potentially through some infested nursery stock. So systemic neonics, they work pretty well on these, but they're not 100% effective. And bees do visit crepe myrtles to some extent, so you really need to be careful using a neonic. In fact, most neonics are not allowed on blooming crops. You know, there's some drench applications that work pretty well with dinotephuron or imidacloprid. Most of these are based on the diameter of the trunk. And crepe myrtles, as you know, most of them are multi-stem or multi-trunk. So you can't just go by the base. You have to basically add the diameter of all of those multi-trunks together. It can be a fairly large volume of material you have to drench with. Foliar applications work pretty well also, but you're really knocking out a lot of these natural enemies when you use it. Speaking of natural enemies, entomologist, ornamental entomologist David Held on Auburn's campus is doing a good bit of work looking at natural enemies as a potential control strategy for crepe myrtle bark scale. He and his student Nate. So they have been taking infected plant material and exposing it to lady beetles and having some really great results. Really actually just incredible results. But the fourth instar of ladybugs have been shown to consume about 400 crepe myrtle bark scale eggs a day. That's a considerable amount. In their research, they're seeing 75 to 90% removal of crepe myrtle bark scale, the eggs, crawlers, by these ladybugs. And so they've got a lot of great data using ladybugs. Which ladybug works the best, they're still working that out. They're also looking at what types of lures they can use to attract these ladybugs to infested trees. So you can put these lures on a tree and it'll attract these beetles in, and they can do their job without using any chemicals in some cases. So this is some pretty exciting work on a crepe myrtle bark scale, and I look forward to see what David's and Nate's research is going to show us in the next year. Another scale that you'll see in the southeast primarily, it's big in Florida, Alabama, many of the southern states, it's false oleander scale. This can be a really difficult to control scale. It's got an okay amount of hosted effects, for ornamental crops, Akuba, many palm species. It loves windmill palms. It likes pindo palms, needle palms, Mediterranean fan palms, but it really prefers those windmill palms. You'll see them occasionally on cycads, and don't confuse it though with the cycad scale. They look kind of similar, but it is a different scale. And they really like magnolias. You'll see them all over Magnolia grandiflora, a lot of our native magnolias, and they can overwinter those in swamps or wooded areas all around the landscape. And so that can make control a big challenge. The biggest challenge in controlling this insect is there's no synchronized crawler stage. So those females are just spitting out crawlers all year long. And so any kind of time spray application it can be not very effective, because you may kill some crawlers and then a month later or even a couple of weeks later they may have another hatch. And so it's really hard to know when they're going to be hatching. Again, David Hell's lab has done some great work on this. They were monitoring crawler emergence throughout the entire year last year and got some great data. Some of the data showed that they saw all life stages peak around July and November. And what they're suggesting is that an early spring application, maybe even as early as January or February here on the Gulf Coast, may be the most effective for an insecticide application, because that's when the population is at its lowest. Also, some of David's work and some experiments I've done myself have shown that mineral oil can really wipe these adults out, even under the waxy coating. It'll kill the adults. Probably, some of the studies we've seen, it does even a better job than acephate or orthene. So they work really well. The only problem is you'll kill the adults, but it does not kill the eggs. And so those eggs can exist even without the mother being alive, and those can hatch out. And so hit them early in the spring, really early in the spring, can really knock back that population and give you a better opportunity to control them throughout the year. Now, there are some things out there that look like scales that aren't. Some people can confuse mealybugs, and this is what you call artillery fungus. This is a fungal reproductive structure that actually gets shot out from the fungus. You might see this on the side of your house, vinyl siding, gets on plants, on tree trunks, gets on leaves. So don't confuse it with a scale. It can be controlled by controlling the fungus. That might be using certain types of mulch or really reducing the humidity in the area, but it is not a scale, and any kind of insecticide application is just going to be a waste of money. So, but anyway, that's about all the slides I have. Do we have any questions on scale insects on ornamentals?
Dr. Pickens, thank you. Okay, guys. If you have questions, it's time to go ahead and put those in the chat box.
Jeremy, there was a question about purchasing beetles for biocontrol agents. Can you talk about how well purchasing biocontrol agents works in the actual landscape?
Yeah, it's probably, I don't have a ton of it. I haven't done it, but from what I understand, it's not as effective as indoors in a greenhouse. But I think, you could probably get some control with it. I don't know how cost effective it is just yet. That's kind of why David is looking at the lures. And so instead of buying them in, you're just attracting the native population in. And once they start feeding and have that food source, they'll reproduce on their own. So promoting what you already have can probably be a better control strategy in the landscape environment for using some of those lady beetles.
Anyone else?
There's a question about do mealybugs have natural enemies?
Yeah, they do. There's actually one called a mealybug destroyer. So as the name implies, it goes right after mealybugs. And so yeah, mealybugs do have natural enemies, and there's probably more than I'm unaware of that have probably attacked the juvenile stages also.
Oh, they're popping up faster than I can read. How long after applying neonics before they are no longer present in the plant?
I don't know the answer to that. Vicki, do you know?
And that one can be a hard one too, because that also depends on the plant and the timing of application.
Yeah, that's true.
Right.
And there's some species, that it won't go into the flower fruit, just depending on the species. So go ahead, Vicki. I'm sorry.
Couldn't unmute my mic. So whenever there's a whole bunch of things that are dependent. So it depends on which product you've applied, how you have applied it, temperature, humidity, soil temperature, the amount of water, and how fast the stuff inside the plant is moving. I mean, there's all sorts of factors that play into how long and how persistent a pesticide is going to be in the environment and in the plant and in the soil.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't give you it has this many days. We can't tell you that. There's a whole bunch of factors that play into that.
Mm-hmm. There is, and there's, as neonics are kind of getting a bad rap, some of these chemical companies are in a rush to look for other products that can be used on some of these piercing and sucking insects. I don't know how well they work on scales, but there's a couple of new products like Ventigra or Altus through Bayer BASF that work well on piercing sucking insects and are fairly bee friendly. But I don't know if they work on scales. I'm not that familiar with their labels, but it kind of targets their mouth parts is how some of those new chemistries are working, specific to those species.
Oh, I mean this. So will cold weather, winter weather, and Mr. Haynes, I don't know where you are, but I'm patiently awaiting a little bit of cold winter weather. But is cold a factor in limiting the amounts or the population of scale insects the following year?
I think, I don't know for sure, but I think that it depends on the species of scale, so I think it does. I think some of the armored scales are a little more cold adapted. I don't really see I'm not aware of a drop in population for example, the false oleander scale. When we get super cold every couple of years, we have a really hard freeze here on the Gulf Coast. So I think it kind of depends on the species. I'm sorry, I don't have a great answer for you on that.
And sometimes it's not the cold that's the factor, but it's how long the warmer weather goes on.
That's true. Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm. And some of these scales are hanging out in little microclimates. If it's in your yard, maybe it's near a brick wall. So it may be cold outside, but not as cold as you think in that microclimate.
Okay, here's one for the two of you guys. And Imidacloprid, again, in imidacloprid, there is still so much to learn about that chemical. But you said it was damaging to the beetles. How? Is this because it is the scale that they are feeding on?
I read that. I don't, in another publication, I don't know. I mean, it's an insecticide, and I've heard it from a colleague over at LSU remind us that homicide, suicide, insecticides, they all are sides and they kill things, so it is an insecticide. And so if it's sprayed on a natural enemy, it can kill it, maybe potentially through contact, I would assume. But I don't know for sure on that. Vicki, do you know?
I'm sorry, I was answering another question, so I wasn't even paying attention.
Okay. It was basically she was asking, how do some of these neonics affect the natural enemies? Can it reduce the population if they come in contact to it?
It can affect their populations, but it's not to the degree that some of the media is portraying. And it also depends on what insect it is and where it is in the plant part, how much there is in the plant part. And I mean, there's a whole bunch of different factors.
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll while we're wrapping up so I don't forget.
I see a question that says, did you say there are insecticides that target insects with piercing, sucking mouth parts? And yes, there is. Some of the newer chemistries do. They're very specific in which insects they target. I'm not super familiar with the chemistry, so I'm not going to try to guess the labels right now. But they're out there. They're fairly new.
Looking for some more questions. I see one more pop up.
Saw somebody ask about the artillery fungus and what mulches work better. In some cases, it may be best not to have any mulch there, and maybe even use rocks because they need that humidity. And if it's real humid area, that bark or whatever it is may allow make it more favorable. But I would say probably pine straw or any really coarse mulch where that top layer is going to dry out would be best.
And it's also one of those things, if that spot is staying so wet that it's promoting artillery fungus growth, you may need to correct a moisture issue in that spot too.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Let's see, anyone else? Okay, there was another question about lady beetles and a soil applied imidacloprid a threat to this beetle.
I mean, most of the time, if you're applying as a drench, it's not going to be an issue for your natural enemies for the most part, I would say.
Okay, anyone? Anyone else? I see a couple of comments, very informative. Thank you, and I agree, Ms. Thomas. I thought it was very informative as well. And you
remember that you guys can go online next week and watch this webinar again, and you can also see our past webinars.
Yep, those are always recorded, and those are put on the internet or put back on the 2019 All Bugs Good and Bad page by Monday. So if that's it, I hope everyone has a great weekend. We will see you next month. Let's see, November 1st. Same time, same place for spiders that are commonly found in houses by Vicki Bertinelli from Clemson Extension. So Dr. Pickens, we thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Everybody have a great weekend.